A Mustang mare abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Everyone thought it was too late for her, but when one man found her, everything changed. The bond they formed wasn't just about saving her life, it was about saving an entire band. What happened months later will shock you. Get ready for an emotional roller coaster that will restore your faith in courage, hope, and the power of love. This is a story you won't forget. John Miller had spent most of his life on a small farm, nestled in the rugged hills of Arizona. Iona. After retiring from the military, he sought solitude far from the chaos of cities and the noise of the world. His farm, surrounded by vast desert land, was his peaceful sanctuary. The only company he had were his animals, the endless sky, and the occasional breeze that swept through the dry plains on a particularly quiet afternoon. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, John felt an unfamiliar pull in his gut, a sense that something was wrong. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he needed to check on the farthest corners of his land. There was a certain energy in the air that day, something that made his skin prickle and his heart race. Driving his old beaten down truck, he headed toward the distant range. The terrain was harsh, and the roads were little more than dirt tracks. As John rounded a bend, he saw it, something dark on the horizon, barely visible against the vast emptiness. It could have been a rock or a pile of desert brush, but as he got closer, his heart dropped. It was a horse, a Mustang mare. She was lying in the dirt, struggling for breath. Her coat was caked with grime, and she looked like she hadn't eaten or drank in days. John's stomach turned as he recognized the signs. She was pregnant, her belly swollen and heavy with full. He knew this was bad. The mare was weak, nearly lifeless, and there was no one around to help her. Without hesitation, John slammed on the brakes and leaped from the truck. His boots hit the dusty ground as he rushed to her side. The mare's eyes flickered with pain as she tried to lift her head, but failed. Jen knelt beside her, gently touching her side. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. Her strength was fading, but there was still a flicker of life left in her. "Hey, girl," Joan said softly, his voice low and steady. "We're going to get you out of here." John knew the situation was dire. The desert was merciless, and if he didn't act fast, this would be another lost soul in the wild. He had no experience with wild horses, but he couldn't just leave her to die. His hands trembled as he untied the rope from the back of the truck, carefully wrapping it around her neck. With all the gentleness he could muster, he guided her to her feet, supporting her weight with his body. Her legs buckled, but she managed to stand, leaning heavily against him. She was barely holding herself up, but John refused to give up on her. The journey back to the farm was slow, every bump in the road sending waves of pain through her fragile body. "Stay with me, girl," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight with concern. By the time they reached the farm, the was barely conscious. John helped her into the barn, his heart racing with each step. Her breathing was shallow, and she was too weak to stand on her own. He covered her with a blanket and placed a bucket of water near her, though she barely seemed able to drink. Her body trembled, and John could tell she was in extreme pain. He stayed by her side, checking on her regularly. As night fell and the temperature dropped, he didn't leave. He couldn't. The thought of abandoning her now, after everything, seemed impossible. John had always been a man of few words, preferring silence over chatter, but in this moment, as he watched the May struggle to stay awake, he found himself talking to her softly. "You're not alone," he whispered. "I'm here, and I won't leave you." Hours passed, and the mare seemed to hold on. There was no sign of labor yet, but John knew that the FO was close. He could only hope that she was strong enough to carry the baby to safety. As he sat in the corner of the barn, eyes heavy with exhaustion, a deep sense of connection washed over him. He had always felt like an outsider, a man who didn't quite belong anywhere. But here, in the stillness of the barn, with this injured mare and her unborn FO, he felt a bond forged in the silence of the night and the shared fight for survival. "I won't let you die, girl," John murmured, his resolve hardening. You're going to make it. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Jen kept a careful eye on the Mustang and watching her every move as she slowly regained some strength, but every day he feared for her survival. She hadn't yet given birth, and the mare's condition remained fragile despite the small improvements. She seemed to have lost the will to fight. Her eyes, often distant, as if she were slipping into a deep, painful sleep. John spent his mornings preparing food for her and ensuring she had fresh water. He would check on her every hour, speaking to her softly, as if his words could give her the strength she needed. But no matter how many times he reassured her, the mare's fate still seemed uncertain. The harsh desert sun beat down on the barn during the day, but inside it was cooler. He had set up fans to circulate the air, hoping to provide some comfort. He placed fresh straw beneath her body, hoping to keep her as comfortable as possible. Each time he left her side, John felt a deep pang of guilt. He wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps his own loneliness or the bond that was growing between them, but he felt responsible for her survival. His farm was small, and there wasn't much help available. His nearest neighbor was miles away, and while he had a few contacts at the local vet's office, he had no idea when they would be able to make it out here. Days passed in a blur, and John began to question his own resolve. Was he doing enough? Should he be doing more? It was on the fourth day, just as the sun was beginning to set, that things took a drastic turn. John was in the barn, carefully checking on the May, when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The May's breathing had become more rapid, her sides heaving with each breath. She was finally showing signs of labor. His heart raced as he realized the foal was coming. Without wasting a moment, John rushed to her side. Her body trembled, and she winced with each contraction. Sweat beat on her forehead, and John could see the exhaustion written in her eyes. She was too weak to stand, her legs shaking as the pain of labor gripped her. He knew that giving birth in such a fragile state could be deadly for both her and the FO, but there's no turning back. Now, come on, girl, he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. You've got this. I'm here with you. The May let out a low whinny, her body stiffening with the next wave of pain. John rubbed her neck gently, offering what comfort he could. His mind raced, knowing he needed to help in any way possible, but he wasn't sure how much more she could take. He had no experience with horses giving birth. As the hours dragged on, John stayed at her side, his heart pounding with each painful cry. The mare's labor was long and exhausting, but finally, just as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the FO arrived. It was a difficult birth, and the FO was weak, its coat slick with the fluids of birth. But as John gently wiped the FO clean, he saw it, the small, fragile body of the newborn horse, struggling to stand, but determined. The May, too exhausted to stand, nuzzled the FO weakly, letting out a soft whinny of reassurance. John felt a surge of relief wash over him. The FO had made it against all odds. The M had made it, but there was no time to rest. The battle wasn't over yet. The FO needed to be fed, and the M needed to regain her strength. John worked quickly, moving the FO closer to its mother, encouraging it to nurse. It was slow at first, the full 2 weeks to latch on properly, but after a few tries it found its way. The mare's eyes closed in exhaustion, but she still managed to nuzzle her FO, a soft expression of love and care despite her fatigue. Joan stood back, watching the two of them, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had done it. He had saved them both. But this was just the beginning. The mare and her FO still had a long road ahead of them, and John knew that the challenges weren't over yet. There was still the matter of the band, the wild Mustangs that had once roamed the desert alongside the May family she hadn't seen in months. John had heard rumors of wild Mustangs in the area, wild, untamed, and free, but he knew the May's survival would be only half of the battle. To truly help her, he needed to reunite her with her own. John's mind raised as he watched the May rest the FO now nestled by her side. He didn't know how he would find the band or if they were even still alive, but he knew one thing for certain: he would do whatever it took to give the Mayar and her FO the life they deserved. The sun had fully risen by the time John left the barn, his body aching from the long night, but as he stepped out inside and took in the cool morning air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would be difficult, but John was determined to help the May and her F. The band was out there, and John would find them no matter what it took. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing despite the relief of seeing the May and her full safe. He couldn't ignore the deep, aching pull in his chest. The May was not just any wild horse she had once been part of, something bigger, a band that had roamed the vast desert free and untamed. John knew that reuniting her with her family was the only way to truly give her peace, but finding the band in the desert wasn't going to be easy. He had heard rumors over the years, tales of wild Mustangs that lived in the hills, hidden away from civilization, but the desert was vast, and the band could be anywhere. John had spent months getting to know the land, but he was no tracker. His survival skills were more geared toward farming than horseback riding, and he had no experience when it came to locating wild animals. Still, he couldn't let that stop him. That afternoon, after a long day of tending to the mar and full, John decided it was time to begin his search. He saddled up his old horse, a sturdy gelding named Charlie, who had been with him for years. Charlie was dependable, though no match for the wild Mustangs that roamed the desert. But for now he would do. Jan knew this would be a journey of trial and error, but it was a journey he had to take. The air was hot as they set off the ground beneath their hooves, dry and cracked from the unrelenting sun. John kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. There were no roads to follow, no trails to guide him, just endless stretches of desert that seemed to go on forever. He was alone in this vast wilderness, and the thought of finding the band felt impossible. As the day wore on, John found himself feeling the weight of the journey. Charlie was starting to slow down, and the desert heat was wearing on him, but he pressed on, determined to find the Mars family. He knew that if he didn't make the effort, he would always regret it. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something caught John's eye. In the distance, he squinted, his heart leaping in his chest as he saw a shadow moving against the orange glow of the setting sun. At first he thought it was just another mirage, the desert playing tricks on him, but as he rode closer, he realized it was real, a horse, a wild Mustang. John's pulse quickened. Could this be the band? He had no way of knowing for sure, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that this was the first sign he had been waiting for. He urged Charlie forward, his eyes fixed on the horse ahead. The Mustang was grazing, unaware of John's approach. He slowed his pace, not wanting to scare it away. He needed to get closer to see if there were others. He crept through the sand, Charlie's hooves barely making a sound. As he drew nearer, he saw the wild horse lift its head, its ears flicking as it sensed something was ice. It was a beautiful creature with a coat that shone in the fading sunlight. Its muscles rippled beneath the surface, and there was a sense of power in its movements, but it was alone, no sign of the band. John's heart sank. This was just one lone horse. The band was nowhere to be found. He sat quietly for a moment, studying the Mustang. It was calm, almost serene, yet there was a sadness in its eyes, a reflection of the same loneliness that John had been feeling ever since the Mayor arrived at his farm. He could sense it. This was a horse that had been through hardship, just like the Mayor. "Are you looking for your family too?" John whispered, more to himself than to the horse. He didn't expect an answer, but it was comforting to think that they both shared this deep yearning for something lost. The wild horse turned its head and, sensing no immediate threat, began to walk away, its body graceful and fluid as though it were one with the desert itself. John watched it disappear into the distance, but the sight gave him a strange sense of purpose. If he could find this one Mustang, then maybe the band was out there somewhere just beyond. His reach he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. As the night began to fall, Jen made camp. The temperature dropped quickly, and the silence of the desert was almost overwhelming. He sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, his mind racing. He needed more information. He couldn't just wander the desert aimlessly, hoping to stumble upon the band. The next day, he decided to take a different approach. He would go to the nearby town where he knew there were people who had seen the wild Mustangs before they could provide him with the information he needed to find the rest of the band. He hoped that someone in town had seen them recently, or at least knew where they typically roamed. The town was only a few miles from John's farm, but it felt like another world. The hustle and bustle of life in town stood in stark contrast to the quiet desolation of the desert. People moved quickly, caught up in their own lives, and Joan felt like an outsider in this place he rarely visited, preferring the solitude of his land to the crowded streets of town. But today he had no choice. He needed answers. John rode Charlie into town, the sound of the horse hooves on the hard-packed dirt road, a constant reminder of the task at hand. His mind kept racing. Could he really find the band? Was there a chance that someone in this town had seen them recently? He dismounted at the local diner, a small, weathered building with a faded sign. Inside, the smell of strong coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The few patrons sitting at the counter barely glanced up as John entered, all of them lost in their own thoughts. He walked to the counter and took a seat. Morning, the waitress said, without looking up, her voice flat. Morning, John replied, trying to make himself comfortable. He could feel the tension in the air, the same kind of unease that he often felt when he was out of his element. He ordered coffee, and as the waitress poured him a cup, John gathered his courage. I've been looking for something, he started. Actually, someone, a band, a wild Mustang herd. At the mention of Mustangs, the waitress paused for a second, then looked at him. Her eyes softened a bit. A band, huh? You're not the first one to ask about that. Some folks still talk about them, but they're not easy to find, especially now. John leaned in, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Well, she said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. There used to be a lot of them around these parts, wild Mustangs that roam the desert freely, but in the last few years they've been spotted less and less. Some say it's because of the drought, others say it's poachers, who knows, but there's still one band left out there. John's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the band, she continued, her voice dropping lower. They say a few miles east of here, near the old canyon. You might still find them, but you'll need to be careful. The desert isn't kind to those who don't know its ways. John felt a sense of hope rising in him, but it was tempered with the weight of what she had said. He had to be careful. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. The band wasn't just a family of wild horses. It was the key to the mayor's survival. If he could reunite her with her family, perhaps she would have a chance to recover fully. Thanks, John said, his voice filled with gratitude. I appreciate it. The waitress nodded and returned to her work, but John's mind was already racing. He had a direction now, the old canyon. If the band was there, he would find them. John paid for his coffee, then headed back to Charlie, who was waiting patiently outside. The sun was beginning to climb higher in the sky, and the heat was becoming unbearable. But Jen didn't care. He had a plan. He had hope. As he rode east, the landscape shifted. The land became rockier, the ground more uneven, and the air seemed to grow thicker with dust. Jan had no idea what he was about to encounter, but he wasn't going to stop. Now he couldn't. The M and her FO were depending on him. The canyon wasn't far. But by the time John arrived, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the desert floor like dark fingers reaching toward him. He paused at the edge of the canyon, looking out over the vast expanse. The silence was deafening. Not a single sound disturbed the air, except for the occasional rustle of wind in the sparse desert grass. John felt the weight of the moment. If the band was out here, they had to be close. He had come this far, the May was. Depending on him, he dismounted, tethering Charlie to a nearby rock as he stepped. Forward his boots, crunching on the dry ground, his senses were on high alert. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He was close. Suddenly, there was a sound. In the distance, something shifting in the sand, a movement. Jan froze his eyes, scanned the canyon walls, then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared, a wild Mustang, a powerful dark stallion. His coat was matted with the dust of the desert, and his eyes shone with an unmistakable intelligence. John's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any wild horse. This was the leader of the band, and the stallion was looking directly at him for a long moment. Neither of them moved. The stallion stood there watching John with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Then, without a sound, the Mustang turned and disappeared into the canyon, vanishing into the rocky terrain. Jan didn't hesitate. He followed. John moved cautiously through the canyon, his boots crunching softly on the dry ground. The evening sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was cooler now, but the heat of the day still lingered in the bones of the earth. John's mind was racing. He had seen the stallion. He had to be close now. He continued down the narrow path, following the stallion's trail. The canyon was a labyrinth of sharp turns and rocky outcroppings, but John's determination pushed him forward. Every sound, every gust of wind, every rustle of the dry grass made his heart skip a beat. He was closer than ever to finding the band, and he wasn't about to let anything stop him now. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, he spotted movement ahead. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just the stallion anymore. There were others, dozens of wild Mustangs, all gathered in a small clearing just ahead. The band. John's heart raced with excitement. He had found them, but as he approached cautiously, something fell off. The horses weren't grazing or moving as freely as he had expected. They stood in tense silence, their heads raised, ears flicking nervously. The stallion was among them, but he wasn't standing proudly at the front. Instead, he was pacing restlessly, his eyes darting around the clearing as though searching for something. John instinctively slowed his pace. He could feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. It didn't take long for John to notice the source of the disturbance in the distance. Across the canyon, a figure appeared on horseback, a rider cloaked in dark clothing, moving swiftly toward the band. John's heart sank. He had heard stories of poachers and horse traders who roamed the desert looking for wild Mustangs to capture and sell. It seemed like this was no coincidence. The band was in danger. Without thinking, John spurred Charlie into action. He had to warn them. The Mustangs needed to be protected. He raced toward the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The wild horses noticed him immediately, and as he approached, they began to scatter, moving swiftly and gracefully like shadows against the desert sky. The stallion was the last to leave. He glanced back at John, his eyes filled with a strange understanding, and then, without hesitation, he bolted, disappearing into the canyon as if he had never been there. John pulled Charlie to a stop, frustration surging through him. He had only just found them. The band was slipping away, vanishing into the vast desert. And worse, the poachers were still out there, closing in on the wild horses. But there was no time to waste. John had to act fast. He couldn't let the band be captured, not after all he had been through to find them. He scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of the rider. The poacher was still out there, somewhere, moving through the canyon. John couldn't let him get any closer. With a surge of determination, John made a decision. He would lead the band to safety. There was a cave nearby, a place he had visited as a child when he had wandered the desert. It was hidden away, concealed by the canyon's twists and turns. The band could take refuge there until he could figure out a more permanent solution. John's mind raced as he turned Charlie around, heading toward the cave. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he had no idea if the wild Mustangs would follow him, but it was the only chance they had as he rode through the canyon. John's thoughts were consumed by the image of the stallion's eyes that had seen too much, had endured too much. The Mustangs had survived the harshest conditions, but poachers were a threat they couldn't face alone. When John reached the cave, he dismounted and tethered Charlie to a nearby rock. The moon was rising, casting an eerie glow over the canyon. It was then that John heard its soft, distant whinnies, followed by the steady thud of hooves on the ground. The band was coming. They had followed him. John's heart leaped in his chest as the wild Mustangs emerged from the shadows, moving silently toward the cave. The stallion led them, his powerful form cutting through the darkness with unmatched grace. Slowly, one by one, the Mustangs filed into the cave, finding shelter in the cool, rocky interior. Joan stood in awe as the last of the Mustangs entered. He had done it. He had saved them for now, but he knew this was only the beginning. The poachers would not give up easily. John had to find a way to protect them permanently to ensure their survival. And as he looked out over the dark desert, he realized that the battle was far from over. The night was eerily quiet, the desert holding its breath as John stood guard outside the cave. The wild Mustangs, now led within, were calm but restless, aware of the danger that still lingered. Jan had led them here, but now the real challenge began. He had to protect them no matter the cost. He paced back and forth, the weight of his responsibility heavy on his shoulders. The stallion, whom John had begun to think of as his ally, stood just inside the cave's entrance, his dark eyes watching John with an intensity that seemed almost human. The other Mustangs were gathered in a corner, huddled together for warmth, but the stallion refused to leave his post. John paused, his hand resting on Charlie's man. As the horse nickered softly, he could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending danger growing stronger by the minute. The poachers weren't far behind. They had to be close. Suddenly a sound broke the silence, a distant rumble, the faint echo of hooves in the night. John's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this, but the reality of it still sent a shiver down on his spine. The poachers had arrived. Jan mounted Charlie in one swift motion, his hand gripping the reins with a fierce determination. He knew this wasn't just about saving the Mustangs anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. This was a battle for freedom, for life itself. He spurred Charlie forward, moving toward the mouth of the canyon where the poachers would have to pass. The Mustangs were still inside the cave, safe for now, but they couldn't stay hidden forever. Jen needed to buy them time. As he approached the entrance, he saw them, two men on horseback, moving slowly through the canyon. Their figures were silhouetted against the rising moon, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They hadn't noticed John yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. John's pulse quickened. He had to act fast. He was outnumbered, but he had the advantage of knowing the terrain. He had to use that to his advantage. The men were getting closer, their voices carrying in the still night air. "We're getting close," one of them said, his voice low and growly. "We've got to flush them out before they disappear again." John's grip tightened on the reins. He could hear the poachers' plans clearly now, and his stomach turned. They were getting close to the Mustangs. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. John urged Charlie forward, cutting across the canyon in a wide arc. The poachers would be forced to take a longer route to catch up with him. As they neared a narrow pass, John pulled Charlie to a halt, and he turned to face the approaching riders. "Hey," he shouted, his voice carrying over the canyon, "if you're looking for wild horses, you're too late. They're gone." The poachers froze, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of John. The taller of the two men sneered, dismounting from his horse. "You think you can stop us?" he spat. "Those horses are ours, and we're taking them whether you like it or not." John's heart raced as he sized up the situation. These men weren't just poachers. They were ruthless. They wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to capture the Mustangs. John had to stop them. He couldn't let them take the wild horses. "You're not taking them," John said, his voice steady but fierce not while I'm. Here the man laughed, drawing a knife from his belt. You're just one man, what? Do you think you can do against us? Before John could respond, the other poacher spurred his horse forward, aiming to rush past him, but John was ready. He kicked Charlie into motion, charging directly at the man. Charlie's hooves pounded the ground, and the poacher's horse reared in surprise. Throwing its rider off balance, John swung his horse around in a sharp arc, blocking the second poacher's path. The man cursed, spurring his horse to charge, but Charlie was too fast. With a swift movement, John grabbed the reins of the poacher's horse, pulling it to a stop just inches from the edge of a steep drop. The poachers were no match for John's determination. The first man, seeing his partner defeated, quickly realized the situation wasn't in his favor. He turned his horse and fled, shouting over his shoulder, "This isn't over." John watched them disappear into the canyon, his heart still pounding with adrenaline. It was over for now. He had bought the band some time, but the battle was far from one. The poachers would return, they always did. But for that moment, John felt a sense of triumph. He had defended what was right. He had stood his ground as he turned Charlie around and rode back to the cave. He was greeted by the silent presence of the band. The stallion was still standing at the entrance, watching him. There was no sign of the other Mustangs, but John knew they were safe, for now the fight was far from over. But in that moment, John knew he wasn't alone. He had the band with him, and they would face whatever came next together. The early morning light broke over the canyon, painting the landscape in hues of pink and gold. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of desert wildflowers. John sat atop Charlie, his gaze drifting over the canyon walls, his mind still racing from the events of the previous night. The poachers had been driven off for now, but John knew the danger wasn't over. They would return, and next time they might not be so easy to fend off. But for that brief moment, everything was quiet. The band was safe, hidden deep within the cave, and John had done what he could to protect them. He had kept his promise. As he waited, a faint sound reached his ears, hoofbeats, soft but steady. His heart skipped a beat. He knew those hoof beats. He had heard them before. Turning Charlie toward the sound, John rode slowly toward the clearing, and then he saw them, the wild Mustangs emerging from the shadows of the canyon. The stallion eluded them, his man flowing in the wind like a dark river. His coat gleamed in the early light, and there was a new sense of calm about him, a quiet strength that John had never seen before. One by one, the Mustangs emerged, moving gracefully into the open space. They were free, and they knew it. John dismounted and approached the stallion slowly, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and pride. The band had trusted him. They had followed him, believed in him, and now they were free, just as they had always been meant to be. The stallion walked toward JN, his eyes locking with his in a moment of unspoken understanding. John could feel the connection between them, the bond that had formed over the past few months. They were no longer just a man and a wild horse. They were partners, allies in the fight for freedom and survival. John reached out his hand, gently resting on the stallion's neck. The wild horse nickered softly, nuzzling his hand. In return, it was a gesture of trust, one man that had meant more than words ever could. The other Mustangs gathered around, watching quietly. They had found their leader, and in him they had found safety. The band was no longer running from fear. They were running toward something greater, a future of their own, a future they would create together. John stepped back, looking around at the wild horses. He knew that the fight wasn't over. The poachers would keep coming, and the dangers of the world would never disappear. But for now, the band was safe, and that was enough. If this story inspired you, remember that true freedom is worth fighting for. Subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who believes in the power of courage and connection. Let's spread the message of hope together.